I feel like part of the problem that I started noticing was the problem of methodology. That somehow, when it came to foreign policy, the debate kind of went like this. First, the US government says country X is somehow bad and needs some kind of intervention of some sort. Step two, everybody, including the critics, start looking at country X, and we start debating, well, do they need intervention? Do they need to be fixed somehow? And then there's an argument of like, well, no, they don't. Yes, they do. And this back and forth. And then third, then it's about, well, who should do the fixing? Should it be them internally reforming? Should it be international organizations, US, NATO, Coalition of the Willing? And then lastly, fourth becomes a question of like, how should they do the fixing? Should it be development schemes? Should it be non-military coercive techniques such as sanctions, or military techniques of different degrees of brutality? That somehow the imperviousness of the US to the scrutiny leveled at other states was just jarring to me. And it's rooted for me in the unique type of sovereignty that the United States enjoys. That there's two types of sovereignty, it seems to me. There's guaranteed sovereignty and conditional sovereignty. That the former colonial powers, including the US, have guaranteed sovereignty. So to say that their government is illegitimate or their borders are artificial or constructed, or to say that they ought to be subject to interrogations by institutions of global governance would be laughable. Even amongst the liberals or the left, we have a tendency of thinking that that's somehow futile or idealistic. We should care about like what we got to be practical in other ways. And everybody else has conditional sovereignty. They got to keep proving that they deserve to be sovereign. What I realized at that point is that that the United States somehow always is outside of interrogation. And so, you know, and so I started thinking, what if it's the opposite? What if the problem starts within the United States itself and then it's projected outwards? And so here, for me, like this all goes back to the very founding of the United States as a settler colony and what it does to native peoples in this territory, right? And one of them is the question of sovereignty itself, and then two, how it goes about then doing kind of what it does, that it always talks about the native population, but it's a projection of its own image onto them that then it deals with. So if we were to take this on, if it's okay, I would like to re-narrativize the war in Iraq, to kind of re-understand it. And for me, the war in Iraq doesn't have anything to do with Iraq. Iraq is not a place that is considered when the Americans are talking about Iraq. There's two Iraqs. There's the Iraq that exists where people live there and do mundane everyday things. And then there's the Iraq in the American imaginary that is just that, it's a fantasy and it's an imaginary. So for me, the war in Iraq really has its roots in the beginning of neoliberalism in the United States in the late 1970s. And here, the roots of it go to the chairmanship of Paul Volcker's tenure of the Federal Reserve, when Volcker's aggressive war on inflationary pressures in the US simultaneously attacked America's working class and what Vijay Prashad talks about as the Third World Project that was happening globally. In the US, it marked the end of Keynesian welfare capitalism that created a space for upliftment specifically for the white working class and European immigrants, especially Eastern Europeans, who were being welcomed into whiteness as a racial category. And at the same time, this neoliberal restructuring then decimated the social wage in the US. It created precarity amongst people as neoliberal restructuring transnationalized production, deindustrialized the US, and eviscerated private sector unions. And so this created a political problem where the state was unwilling to provide support to people who were being dislocated by a profound restructuring of the capitalist economy. So then the way that this problem was resolved for the U.S. Like, how do you deal with the people that are being kind of the economic ground from under them was being pulled, was through kind of white supremacy, this enduring white supremacy, and anti-black and anti-indigenous racism that constantly throughout the history of the United States was used to bring disparate forces within the American elite together. So neoliberalism, when it came in and it hollowed out liberal political institutions in the U.S., it really enabled the rise of neoconservatism, despite the ideological tension between neoliberalism and early neoconservatism. So neoconservatives, now we understand them as having they're being very foreign policy heavy. But at the time when they're first kind of emerging, it was racial resentment that animated their critique. Many, again, were Eastern European Jewish thinkers who, at the time when the category of whiteness was expanding, it was these folks, these intellectuals, sought to advance their inclusion into whiteness by contrasting themselves with black folks, with native folks. And, you get all of this stuff about the pathologizing of black families and stuff like that out of this initial kind of move by neocons. And intellectually, this was couched in their disdain for the new left at the time. And neocons then became known later on for their anti-Soviet Cold War policies, which again was laced with a racialized worldview as they decried anti-colonial movements. And at another strand at the time was what becomes known as the Paleoconservatives, who don't like neocons because they believe the neocons are liberals in disguise. They criticize neoconservatives for opposing communism based on liberal democratic rhetoric of universal values and so-called human rights, as opposed to American values, in quotes, and institutions and kind of an ethnic racial composition. So initially, the Reagan administration was able to bring these two together through kind of a policy of fusionism that welded these disparate forces together through kind of an anti-communist rhetoric and anti-Cold War rhetoric, and at the same time that the material wages of whiteness was diminished, you had kind of the moral panics around crime, social disorder, that was all being kind of dealt with through culture war politics, right? English-only legislations, PBS, National Endowment for the Arts, like these were the ways in which the state mystified and obfuscated economic conditions of precarity while stoking racial anxieties. And so these racial anxieties were channels that were already built within the American psyche, built around racism against Native people, around racism against black folks. So these were already there, that they were just kind of shoveling deeper into.